change. So as of today, and rather as of the end of February, as of the day Z, as we call it now, Russian economy was a highly export-oriented, mid-level GDP per capita economy. The GDP per capita was about $10,000 per year in absolute terms, not in purchasing power parity terms. The exports exceeded 26% of the GDP, which put Russia in a cohort of very export-dependent countries. For comparison, the United States export about 11% of the GDP. Oil was 40% of these exports, and 60% of oil went to the European Union. Gas was 15% of exports, with 55% of gas going to European Union and the Eastern Europe countries. Agro products, metals, machinery was 10% each, and arms and military equipment was another 10%. It was poorly paid for, but still it was counted against the exports, and everything else was insignificant. So given that, we can foresee what's going to happen with the Russian economy when metals, machinery, coal, and arms will be cut off the exports almost completely, and oil and gas is now in question. We'll talk about it in a minute. The country enjoyed the huge current account surpluses over the years because of the exports of the hydrocarbons primarily. The stagnation of the Russian economy and the stagnation of the domestic demand added up to that current account surplus. So the country became richer and richer by year, and the population in the country was not. Eventually, we haven't seen the levels of the personal disposable income of 2013, never since 2013. And the current levels pre the day Z were about 10% below the 2013 levels. The country was also very much import dependent. 40% of food, 65% of the consumer devices, 95% of the industrial devices were imported. The Russian production, which grew relatively after the declaration of the import substitution program, was also heavily dependent on the inputs from the West and from China. About 95% of the domestic output used certain inputs imported from these countries. Over 50% of the imports or the inputs or the spare parts came from the European Union and other countries which are now declared unfriendly. 25% of that came from China. And these flows were not intersecting, they were not interchangeable. Western technologies were employed in the major production part and the logistics part and the automation of the civil services and civil production. Oil and gas exploration still depends heavily on the companies which operate under the flags of the unfriendly countries, including those like Schlumberger or Halliburton. The production of the machinery is almost fully dependent on the Western technologies and drawings and the engineering. Chemical production is almost fully dependent on the European chemical technologies. Automation is mostly German and Austrian, and so on. We can talk about different fields of the industries in Russia. The majority of them would depend on the European inputs, ending with the agriculture itself, the seed farm, the chemicals, the part of the fertilizers, the devices that allow the efficient introduction of the fertilizers into the soil, all are of European production. The other interesting fact is that's important for the understanding of the development of the economy after the day Z is that Moscow, the capital of Russia, represents about 12% of the population living in Russia, but at the same time consumes 60% of the imports imported to Russia, and is the nest of the financial system of the country. About 80% of the balances of the financial system belong to Moscow and the Moscow suburbs. 70% of the capital construction goes in Moscow region, and the Moscow budget, and together with the Moscow region, is on average 5 times higher than the per capita budget of any other regional center in Russia. After the war was declared, after the invasion, the first economic consequences were obviously the sanctions, which were imposed in five waves so far, and we are expecting the 6th wave. The most evident sanctions were the freeze of the currency and gold reserves. About 60% of the reserves of Russia were immobilized, and most of other reserves are immobilized in part. In Russia, it's much being said about gold as a reserve which still remains with Russian possession. But the problem is that selling Russian gold is almost impossible without touching the US dollar counter of trade, and it's impossible to sell for dollars as of today. And the reserves denominated in yuan are only usable to trade with China. We do not have such a surplus of the trade with China to use these reserves, and we probably will not have. Over 6,000 individuals and companies were sanctioned under the most severe regime of the sanctions, and subsequently, indirectly, more than 10,000 individuals and companies were hurt by the sanctions regime. There was a ban on supply of high-tech products and high-tech technologies. This ban is quite conditional, and it has loopholes within that. We know that many technologies and many devices and many inputs are still being supplied to Russia, and some of them are not, despite the fact that they are quite harmless and they're used to the civil services only. It all creates a big mess in terms of the export and import operations with Russia, and many companies in Russia are ceasing their production, regardless of their affiliation with the military complex, because nobody really knows now what's possible and what's not possible to import to Russia and how best to arrange the imports. The air transportation with Europe stopped, and effectively the sanctions prohibited Russia from having an efficient air transportation within the country. With the delayed effect, we would expect that the air transportation in Russia will become a problem starting autumn and further on. In a year and a half, the efficient air transportation in Russia will be 100% of the past. It will be impossible to have the efficient air transportation domestically. There is a soft maritime blockade in place. We do not call it the maritime blockade because it's not officially declared, but the major carriers stopped servicing Russian loads, Russian cargo. There's just one major carrier which still works with Russia, and probably it's not for long. As a result, a decrease in purchases of oil exceeds 20% as of today. And Russia decreased the production of oil by 17% officially, but I don't trust entirely the figure. I think the decrease in production is higher. It should be like 23–24% at least. And the discount of euros to Brent is now exceeding 40%. And we don't know exactly the figures, the prices that the China is buying Russian oil at. And we probably would not know the real price because all these negotiations are confidential. Sorry, but we can expect that it's more than 40% discount. The purchases of coal decreased dramatically, and I don't have the figure at hand, but it's double-digit, of course. The purchases of metals decreased pretty much the same degree. We know that hundreds of brands are leaving Russia, ceasing to produce in Russia or to deliver to Russia. Again, we don't see the picture clearly now. There are many declarations. Some of them stopped producing, some of them stopped temporarily. Some of them are looking for the way to start selling again. I think the situation will sort out in the months to come. By September, we'll see how many companies still produce in Russia and how many companies still cooperate with Russia. The number of such brands refusing or limiting their cooperation with Russia is increasing by day. Major Russian banks are under sanctions. The international payment systems in Russia malfunction. There are still payments being done for the most important critical goods, but the major flows of the payments stopped to exist. The international credit cards stopped to operate outside Russia for Russian users. The UnionPay is malfunctioning, probably will stop operating for Russian users inside Russia as well. And over time, the MasterCard and Visa will stop operating for Russian users as well. I think we were looking at a year, 2 years period, transition period. After that, Russia would not have sufficient card supplies and sufficient ability to produce the payment cards. Through the days now, through March and April, the war costs Russia about $1 billion every week. It's a bad estimation now, because the major part of that cost is the utilization of equipment which was produced before, and essentially it couldn't be amortized 100% years before. But in 2 to 3 months, Russia would face the solid cost of $1 billion per week at least, because the production of new equipment will be necessary. And the costs of the maintenance of the troops, or the cost of the compensation for the damages would increase. We saw the spike of the domestic demand in Russia led to the inflation spike to the 17% annual terms, and 17% is an official figure. I would rather say that we saw 30% in March, and April figures would be around 20%, and the year-end inflation may be as high as 25%. So the secondary factors will come in place. We saw the ruble falling as low as 120, 130 to dollar. Then the currency control regimes were introduced, and now ruble is being maintained at an artificial level of about 72 to dollar, which does not reflect the market conditions, and reflects only the control of the rate implemented by the Central Bank of Russia. Going forward, that control would be harder to manage, because the sales of oil and gas would diminish, and the exports of other goods would cease to exist in a matter of months. Currently, the ban on grain and corn exports, which was introduced by Russia, is quite painful for the Central Asia region, not that painful for the Eastern Europe yet, but may affect the consumption in the Eastern Europe, and obviously will affect the consumption in the Middle East and Asia, and in the Northern Africa region. We'll see how the world deals with that. We don't know how India will react to that yet. We don't know how China will react to that. China pretty much is capable of substituting the exports from Russia with that regard. We don't know whether China will decrease their reserves for that or not. And we obviously will see what happens with the ban, because when the new harvest comes, Russia has to employ all its storage facilities to contain that. And if it doesn't export that, it'll be spoiled in the fields. As I said, we now see a huge mess in cross-border supply. The transportation tariffs surged 50 to 150%, and the delivery time increases, so that when we deal with meat, for example, something which should be delivered in time, much of the load is being spoiled on the way. The regions like Kaliningrad, for example, suffer from the total blockage of the inputs, and on top of that, the manufacturing plants are being stopped, and Kaluga and Kaliningrad and few other regions which were among the most producing and most wealthy regions of Russia now have significant problems with the current unemployment and with the decrease of the personal disposable incomes. And as I said, we expect the personal disposable income to dive in significantly this year. the secondary consequences obviously include the fleeing Russian people. Ukraine was left by about 4 million people since the start of the war, and about 500,000 Russians left Russia as well. The majority of them were highly profiled professionals, managers, and entrepreneurs. We would expect that about 1 million people will leave Russia this year. It's the biggest wave since the early 90s, since the first Jewish immigration from Soviet Union. And unlike the previous waves, this immigration will be highly skilled, almost 100%. We've evidenced at least 100 super top managers of the Russian corporations live in Russia with no intent to come back. Obviously, the protective measures of the central bank froze billions of United States dollars of Russian companies and Russian individuals within Russia, and billions of United States dollars of the non-residents in Russia. Still, Russia lost about $60 billion in the first days of war before the ban was introduced. Russian investors, 17 million of Russian individuals investors who invested in Russian markets before the 24th of February, lost from 20% to 100% of the investments in that market due to the crash of the markets and the collapse of prices of the Eurobonds. We have hundreds of the official declarations of the biggest Russian economic agents that they stop their investment programs in Russia. We would expect that the domestic direct investments as well as foreign direct investments in Russia will be negative this year, despite the bans on the expatriation of capital. And obviously, the small and medium enterprises would not invest. There would be a massive divestment. We would expect that about 15 to 20% of these small and medium enterprises would be closed this year only in Russia. Automotive production is halved now. It's 50% operational still, but probably the continuation is under question, and the automotive production will barely exist by the year end. It happened that almost 95% of the produced cars had critical parts imported from the European Union, and European Union banned such imports for going forward. The new projects in capital construction in April amount for about 50% of the monthly rate of 1 quarter ago. And the old project, there is a significant decrease in the activities on the old projects. So probably we can expect that going forward, 2022 will see the 50% decrease of the capital construction in Russia. Obviously, the Russian government tried to respond to the changing circumstances. The most important response for the Russian economy to go forward is that the country abandons the ecological and the safety standards that it adopted during the 25th century. The country will be ready to produce cars with the standards that it used in the late Soviet Union era. We probably would expect the cars, the models of that era to be produced in the years to come. The Russian is no more support of the patent and IP rights, including the import controls. So essentially, Russia allowed smuggling of the goods, and it's called parallel imports now. The great distributors would deliver the sanctioned goods to Russia to the extent they can, of course. The exporters now have to sell 80% of the foreign currency reserves, and with regards to the oil and gas, probably the sale would be 100% of the reserves, of the revenue, sorry, because of the special payment conditions that Russia would like to impose for such a trade. There are multiple declarations made by the government about easing conditions to business. We tried to analyze these declarations. We didn't find much of the concrete point in that. Probably it's all the declarations as it used to be before. we don't see any particular progress in the discussions of the further import substitution. And when we talk to the actual producers in Russia, to the managers of the actual plants, they do not quite know what to do. They try to find the ways to substitute the imports they had from the West, and with no much success so far. And probably there wasn't much time for them to achieve any success in that field. We'll again wait for 2 to 3 months to see what's going on there. There are multiple threats on the level of the State Duma and the political parties with regards to the rights to immigrate from Russia, the obligatory recruitment policies, and other similar limitations, which are familiar for those who know what's the militaristic economy and what's the Soviet economy. But none of them became the laws so far, and we probably would not see them for quite a while still. Obviously, generally in Russia, there is a general idea of the great isolation period. Some of the economists say that Russia would adapt for the new situation during 10 years or even more. And the GDP would not come back to the level of 2021 in 10 years. I'm more pessimistic with that regard. I don't think the GDP can ever come to the level of 2021 in the coming years, because of the many factors, not only because of the inability to substitute the imports from Europe, but also because the prices for the hydrocarbons will go down and the dependence of the Russian hydrocarbons will diminish, and the share of the private segment in the Russian economy will decrease. And now these factors will make Russia lose parts of the GDP. And if we talk about the consensus prognosis, we hear the different figures for 2022, but all the prognoses are in the range of 8 to 14% decrease of the GDP, which is higher than 2008, which is higher than the loss is higher than 2008, 1998, and it's comparable to 1993 loss. We now are talking about Russia coming back to the 90s and going in the opposite direction from 97 back down to the 91. We see that about 40% of the industrial production is directly affected by the situation, and we can predict that about 15% will cease to continue to be produced by the year end. We estimate, it's a very vague estimate, that the personal disposable income will be down by 20% by the end of the year. And if it is really so, the real disposable income of a household in Russia will be then equal to that of 1991. And that's a significant drop and a very remarkable result. The inequality will rise. We would estimate that the share of the poor families in the Russian definition of that will reach 50% of the population in Russia by the end of 2023. And 2023 GDP is estimated to decrease by 2 to 3% year over year. It's rather an optimistic prediction, because we do not take into account the possibility of the total oil embargo and gas embargo. We did not count the secondary sanctions, which would effectively prevent Russia from the parallel imports. This estimation is given on the basis that the war ends in 2022 and no significant budget is spent in Russia with regards to Ukrainian territories or Ukrainian issues, and no payments, no reparations, nothing. But the sanctions will not generally pull back. I wouldn't believe that sanctions can generally be pulled back even if the war stops. To conclude, in the long term, we would foresee the deterioration of the current account of Russian economy due to the decrease of the sale of hydrocarbons. And in 5 to 6 years, Russia will come to the zero current account balance policy and imports containment. Logistics will become the biggest bottleneck for everything in Russia. Without cargo planes, without the ability to transport goods from the Far East to the European part of Russia. Without the maritime logistics, Russia will suffer, and the economy will regionalize, creating something which looks a bit like the natural economy for the biggest regions. The others turn to the east, and the attempt to substitute everything with the Chinese production and Asian production will actually result in the decrease of the share of the domestic production and consumption, because it's very hard to substitute the inputs, and it's much easier to substitute the end product. And most of the products that Russia would not be able to produce because of the lack of the inputs will be substituted with the imports of the complete of the end products from China and the alliance. The share of military production obviously will grow after the losses Russian military suffers in Ukraine, and because of the higher demand by the government. And the share of the budget spent on the military and security will obviously grow, which means that the social budget will suffer. Obviously, the science and the technology will not benefit from that. The unemployment will rise. We would expect that the unemployment would be well above 7 million people by the end of this year. It will be partially offset by 3 to 4 million of labor migrants going back to their home countries. But we probably would not be able to evaluate the offset with the actions of the government, allowing people to work in the government, in the state sector, and in the law enforcement, and the increase of the military headcounts. We would expect that Russia will tend to increase the military headcount to the proportional to the Soviet era levels as a result of the Ukrainian campaign, but we cannot be sure that will happen. The domestic demand will greatly shift towards the discount products and towards the domestically produced products because of the cost of the imports. But at the same time, the assortment of the domestically produced products will be much more narrow than it was before. And then the last, but probably not the least, the technological development of Russia will severely stagnate over the years. And the proliferation of the Western technologies, as well as the Eastern technologies into Russia, will be slow and very limited to specific segments. Most probably the new technologies for the end consumption will not proliferate at all. Russia will sustain with the technologies of the previous generation for the years to come. So that's pretty much what we know. Again, I have to reiterate that we do not know much about what is going to happen in the months to come, even in the weeks to come. We'll wait and see. We probably will make a comprehensive report on the Russian economy somewhere in August or September, where we have more facts and more figures to play with.
Thank you. Thank you so much for painting this truly apocalyptic picture of the future of the Russian economy, and in very much detail. We have a lot of questions, so I'll start with a question in the Zoom from Dmitry Kruk. He's asking about your vision on the reasons behind Russia's insistence on gas payments in Russian rubles. What's the major motivation here? Is it trying to secure gas revenues and their influence to the country and protecting Gazprom Bank from sanctions? Or is it supporting hard currency supply in domestic market, or just a political gesture, or maybe something else? And consequently, what are your expectations of what will happen if the EU deny to use this mechanism, and how insistent Russian authorities will be, or they will somehow adjust their demands?
I don't know for sure. I didn't have a talk to Russian officials with regards to that matter. I have to admit I haven't talked to them since the 24th of February on any matters. I do believe that as often in the Russian high circles, that demand is a result of a confusion. Some people tried to influence Kremlin with regards to making ruble more of the global currency, more liquid, and use rubles in the settlements for the Russian goods. The reason for that is quite discussable. Right? China, for example, tries not to allow yuan to be such a currency, and for the good reason. The less is the exposure of your currency to the international settlements, the easier it is to manipulate your currency, and the Chinese understand that. Still, Russians wanted to see ruble as a reserve currency, as a currency which is used in the international settlements. It never happened. The share of ruble was the fraction of the percentage point of the international settlements. And now probably the national pride of Russians played a bad joke with Kremlin. They tried to respond to the European restrictions with a demand to use ruble in the settlements. The Europeans denied that, obviously, for the obvious reason. They don't want to mess with the necessity to buy rubles. The Russians counteracted with the initiative that Europeans would still pay in euros, and Russian bank will exchange that into rubles and then supply these rubles to the suppliers of oil and gas. There was little sense in such an initiative at all. If Europe pays in euros, there's nothing changed. Actually, it's the internal part of the Russian kitchen. Then the Europeans still deny that. I think for multiple reasons. First is then the national European pride. We would never do what Russia says us to do. The second thing is in European financial discipline, it is accustomed to pay to the supplier, not to a third party. And paying to a third party, to a bank, to allow the bank to settle with the supplier makes questions about the legitimacy of that. And then if the supplier claims it didn't get the payment, who's going to be responsible in that sense? The Gazprom Bank, and how to sue Gazprom Bank in these situations. So I pretty much understand why Europeans refuse to do that, and they will insist on refusing to do that. And most probably Russia will agree not to imply that scheme. After all these demarches, after all these trying to block the supply to different countries, Russia will get to terms. The practical reason for the Russian financial system could have been in securing 100% of the sale of the currency revenues, but for the already secured 80% of that, the difference is not much, and men wouldn't create such a hassle for 20% of the currency revenues. So being short, I think that's a result of the major confusion, which is not the first example of such a confusion in the economic field in Russia, and the situation will vanish over time.
Thank you. Yet another question from YouTube. What are the chances for Belarus to decouple from this brave new world of Russia, and what are the chances of its other economic satellites? And let me add on to this question, because right now it looks like the hopes of the Belarusian government, they lie exactly with Russia, and with Belarus somehow taking part in this import substitution efforts and maybe replacing some of the goods which are now being sanctioned or banned by brands. What are your views on that?
No, I don't think that's an economic question. Obviously, economically, if anybody wants to get out of the influence of anybody in that world, it's very easy to do. You can recall the Korean example, the Singaporean example, the examples of the countries of the Eastern Europe or whatever, right? No problem with that. The problem is in the political field. The policymakers in Belarus do not want to decouple from Russia. And unless they want to do that, and maybe now it's the best moment to do that, because Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine, and it wouldn't just be able to sustain Belarus if Belarus wants to decouple. But again, the political decision is to stick with Russia, and most probably Belarus would stick with Russia, at least for a while. Other countries are much more cautious with that regard. Kazakhstan is playing its own game, and Kazakhstan is ready to negotiate the alliance with China on a much more closer terms, and drifts from Russia gradually. And well, Kazakhs are very polite in politics, and they're very polite to Russia now as well. And they will be very politely move from Russia in Chinese direction over time. The Caucasian, the countries in the Caucasus, they play their own games, and they are quite far from Russia anyway. They more and more cooperate with Chinese, and you saw the new Silk Road being operatable through the Caucasus now. The trains are going from China to Europe now, avoiding Russia, and the countries in Caucasus will serve part of that that way anyway. So in that regard, Belarus is probably the unique country.
Thank you. Yet another question. Do you think that if Europe finally imposes the embargo on oil and gas, if that happens, will it lead to Russian ruble devaluation, or under current conditions, the Russian, non-existing market will still be able to sustain the current level of exchange rate?
It's hard to talk about the devaluation. The devaluation is a market term, and there is no market for Russian ruble anymore. If we talk about the change of the control rate, obviously, if the embargo is in place, the situation of the current account changes dramatically. It's not because of the gas embargo, actually. The gas is not much, right? Oil is much more important with that regard. And if it is so, the central bank will look more into the budget issues rather than the issue of the purchasing power of the domestic consumption, domestic market, and the controlled rate will decrease. A ruble will be declaimed to be cheaper. It wouldn't have helped non-residents anyway, because there is a ban on the transactions with the non-residents. But for the domestic market, ruble will be cheaper.
Thank you. There is yet another question from YouTube, which is in Russian, and I would prefer to read it in Russian as well.
In such times as today, new creative ideas emerge about how Turkey can be faster than the whole world. Will Russia bury its economy, or in this counter-monetary system, this is a marginal idea?
Play the question into English for the whole auditorium. The question is whether the domestic original economic ideas expressed by people like Mr. Glaziev or Mr. Patrushev could work in the Turkian economy, like Russia, and help Russia prosper under the circumstances, or it's not viable. It is very hard to tell, because the economy is not math. You cannot prove an expression here, right? Or the only thing we can tell is that it never worked before. In none of the Turkian systems, no inventions helped the system to prosper. There are no prosperous Turkian systems in the world. The authoritarian Chinese economy, which is relatively prospering, and the GDP per capita in China was equal to the Russian GDP per capita before the invasion. But even that economy is open to the world, and it prospers only because it's open to the world. China is a major supplier of goods and services to Europe and to America. Europe is a major supplier of goods and services to China. Without the support of America and Europe, none of the economies can prosper and even think of being stable in the current world. Whatever the ideas you have, whatever the mythology you follow, whatever economic religion you worship.
Okay, thank you. We have no more questions from the audience, and just to end on a positive note, assume that regime change happens for the better in Russia next year. How quickly will the economy recover? Do you think it will be able to be back on track in a couple of years, or there will be long-lasting consequences of this disaster happening right now?
Well, it really depends on what happens with the sanctions. And if the regime changes dramatically and people who are responsible for the war crimes of the war itself are punished and isolated, and there is a thorough process of deputinization of the country, and the Western countries allow themselves to trust Russia at that time. It's very hard to trust Russia now because it was trusted 30 years ago with all the ways and means and traits that the Western economies could. And Russia actually betrayed the union with the Western economies. But so if we expect the West to make the second attempt, Russian economy can get back on track as soon as in 1 year or 2 years period. It's very easy to do that. And obviously, if Russia gets to liberalize the economy and liberalize the political life and turn its face to the developed economies, it can prosper and grow as fast as 6-7% per year, and then even more in 1 to 2 years after the recovery of the disaster.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrei, for delivering this presentation and for answering all our questions. I thank all the participants, and I hope that we will meet again under much better circumstances and we'll have much better prospects to discuss. Thank you and have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.